Dr. Elizabeth Kortlander.
Elizabeth Kortlander.
And,
It's up from the doctor's.
yeah.
It's not me.
So, do you want me to just start talking about the work and about the, we don't have a full chronology here, but as we walk through, you're going to start seeing, the timeline and how things kind of evolve from, early to middle to late. So, and I'll just start, since we're looking at the landscape, I'll start with kind of the landscape era and, these paintings he started to do in around 1974. In 71, he moved from the city to, or the town of Athens. Well, it's a city, small city. But so he moved from that area to the country, and at that time we had a outside of Athens, yes, outside of Athens, Angel Ridge Road, a house on the top of a ridge, so it was up high, it wasn't down in a valley, and I think that height does actually have something to do with the images because you are up, you get some vistas in these paintings, and at that time we had a very large yard, that was mowed, so you get these, areas of fields that would go, and then, the trees in the background, and there were many farms on Angel Ridge, and so lots of just these kind of rolling areas of hills with bits of field and then, areas of trees. And, it's interesting because that has changed over the years, much more gone back to nature. A lot of southeastern Ohio has it. There are less sort of fields and more woods now. And I think, as he started actually with the landscapes, he was more seeing things off in the distance, and then he kind of started moving in, closer and closer.
Yeah, so this, I was going to say, this is sort of, he got a sort of closer vista later on. Some of the, and you can see earlier ones, which we'll probably walk over to.
Yes, we'll walk over.
But he had a more sort of distant originally, and then he brought it up close. Of course, our yard got.
And we'll point those out
too. So I don't know if that had something to do with it.
And I think it's interesting in paintings like this one and this one, the viewer is really almost hovering. You're almost hovering and looking. You see that? Like when your feet really aren't on the ground, you could almost be, in a small plane or something because everything's dropping off, and there's no sense of a plane coming out that you would stand on very easily that you get in a lot of landscapes. So we'll talk more about the landscapes as we get walking through, but they came after the figure paintings. And this is a very early figure painting here. There was a school of painting called the California.
It was the San Francisco Bay artists.
San Francisco Bay artists.
And they had included in that sort of first wave were people like Ebenkorn and I got a couple other names I can tell you later, but I can't remember all of them. But they kind of were reacting to abstract expressionism. And in fact, I think the first person who was coming out of that group who actually did a figurative painting, it was like a scandal. And so they were moving into figurative work. They worked throughout the beginning in the 40s. A lot of them had been in World War II, as had our father. And so there's some introduction to the figurative work. His work has a lot of the same qualities as their work. We don't know how much he was aware of their work.
Yeah, he wasn't like, oh, I'm seeing Ebenkorn and I want to paint like that. We feel he was very much just reaching some of the same conclusions that during the 1950s, late 1940s, abstract expressionism had ruled the art world. It had ruled the art world, and there was a sense that, well, the figure is gone, we're beyond that, that's sort of a mundane thing, and then people started saying, well, a lot of interesting things started to happen in the late 50s and early 60s, and they were social things, and social things are about people, and so these slightly younger artists were saying, I don't really want to just do what you guys have been doing, I want to do something else, and I will do the figure. And it was provocative at first to even do the figure. Interestingly, we're in a kind of a reiteration of that today. Things kind of roll in and roll out, and so the figure has now kind of really gone back out of style, but it's really almost will probably be rolling right back in because today, and we feel that the figure is infused in, there's a sense that the figure is infused in everything. So everything is a stand-in for the figure, if you can understand what I'm saying. So you don't really need the figure, because a chair represents a figure, a chair represents a seated figure. Everything is of us, so everything is the figure. So why would you actually use the actual figure, if that makes sense? But it had been out of vogue, and he was one of the early artists who started saying, you know, this is we're going into the 1960s, there's a social revolution going on, and I'm going to be part of it. So this is one of the earlier ones, and it's just introducing the figure in a space and playing around with it in an abstract way. It becomes an abstract formal element. I'm going to have these abstract shapes that are very expressionistic, and I'm going to paint very expressively, but I'm not going to be afraid to include the figure as simply a form, as a mechanism, as a formal element to include compositionally. And it's really just going to be an everyday genre scene of someone sitting in a chair. There's one of a woman washing in the other room. We'll show you that as we walk on. And so it started with that, but then as the 60s rolled on and social things started happening, these figures were not content to just be formal elements within the work. So this is a very empowered woman confronting the establishment, the man, startled, he's pushing back, you know, like, well, I'm not ready for women to be in my face. But she's just saying, yeah, we're here, and you know, he's establishment, and he's very affronted by that. So we'll see more of that as we move forward.
And I think that it's also been brought up, you know, with that kind of first wave of feminism. I think he was impacted. My mom was reading like, oh gosh, here I am. I'm gonna, Gloria, but the one before Gloria.
Betty Friedan?
Yes, yeah. So my mom had a lot of, you know, there was a lot going on, Ohio University, a lot of faculty wives around, and so, you know, there was a lot going on with feminism, and so I think that also played into it. Also the music of the time. I was just talking to, I think it was Carol, was her name, and my dad painted both out on Angel Ridge, and when we lived in town, he painted in our garages. He used those as the studios. Unlike a lot of, you know, parents of our generation, he really liked the Beatles. He listened to, you know, a lot of that early rock music, and he would listen and paint. And I think, you know, you can see that in terms of some of the vibrancy of the colors and movement and stuff.
Since we're out here, we're kind of talking about these different periods of his work. So, you know, of his major career, you can kind of break it down to the figurative, the transitional, which is the piece behind you, which is very graphic in a way, and it's very form-like, and you know, it really excludes you know, he got rid of the figure. He was done with it. By the time the 70s, by the time the 60s were over, he was ready to move on. And so he started just eliminating the figure, using some of the same kind of forms and shapes and feelings that were in these paintings, and then just starting to play around with those forms and see what happened with them. So this is really just right in the middle of a transitional work where he's really just painting these big forms and shapes, and they really have that look of, you know, the early 1970s. You know, it's hard to really define what it is, but there were many artists during that period who were, you know, coming out of or had a background in commercial art. Andy Warhol, for example, and my father as well, had been a commercial artist. So thinking in terms of just shapes and forms and composition without specific subject, you know, I think came very naturally to him. Shall we move to another?
I was just going to mention also the way he handled the paint it's a more hard edge, less tenderly quality, and I think that was also going on at that time. They were getting into, maybe if you think of some of the artists like Frank Stella, that sort of thing, that hard edge type of work, which obviously when he moved into the landscape, he got back into a more painterly quality, but there is a period where things are flattened and more hard edge.
All right, let's move. Yes.
Could you give us a little background on your father? He was a professor at
Yeah.
OU.
Well, yes, he started out, I'll give a quick chronology. He was in World War II, in the middle of Germany. He came back, and he is of that generation where the GI Bill propelled him. So he went to Michigan State, and he, I think, received his BFA from Michigan State. He did a lot of work for the Spartan magazine, which was the, and after that he did, my brother alluded to this, he actually went down to Texas, and for about a year and a half, he was sort of trying to start a business in commercial art. My father had kind of always these two sides. He had this kind of academic, intellectual side and this artistic side. He ended up, after that, going to University of Iowa, and he got a PhD in art history. But he was also doing a lot of studio art. There's a picture where he's holding, they got a huge Jackson Pollock there, and there's this great picture where he, along with others, standing there, they're putting it up. And so he was always kind of doing those two things. After that, he went to University of Texas in Austin, and he was an art historian there, but he also had a studio. And I remember as a little girl going in there early in the morning. He'd make me coffee with a lot of milk and sugar, and I would watch him paint. So he was, starting to paint. He did win some awards as an artist. He left Texas in '61. Came to Ohio University, hired as an art historian, but I would say, I can't remember exactly when he finally he switched into studio art.
Yeah, one of the reasons why he came is he could teach some studio at Ohio University. So he started teaching studio art for the first time right when he got to OU. He was teaching studio art and art history. And then he had a very good relationship with the head of the department at that time, and he was able to go to him and say, I really just want to be studio faculty, and the head of the department was able to let him do that, and so that's how he switched into that department.
And so, yeah, he was there. He did go to, he had a Baker grant and a sabbatical, '67, '68. We lived in Florence. And he painted there. He had a 3-bedroom apartment. John and I, little kids, got to share a room. And he used one of the bedrooms, which had an attached bath, as a studio. He did a body of work there for a show that was going to be in New York. His sort of later figurative work. There probably are some in here that we can point to. Just as an aside, we were there during the riots in May in Paris. We were taking the France back. That got canceled. His paintings sat on the dock for 6 weeks. He didn't know if he was going to get them back. We went back on a different ship line. So that's kind of just that story. And then he came back and basically was, continued in New York and on the faculty. And he retired in '94, I think, from Ohio University. And he continued to paint. It used to get bad when people would say, so what are you doing now that you're retired? Really?
He first received national attention in the 1965 Art Across America exhibition. This was an exhibition sponsored by the Mead Corporation, and it was a big show where they invited, half of the artists were invited and half were chosen from juried exhibitions. He was one of the invited ones because the then curator of the Columbus Museum of Art was in charge of this portion of they had 4 portions of the United States, and this was the Northeast, and so that the curator or the director at the museum had been familiar with his work and invited him. And there were many big name artists in this. I wish I had the catalog because I could show you. You would know the names, but I don't have that catalog with me. But so he ended up being in the show, and then he ended up winning the Mead Painting of the Year award, and that really skyrocketed his career because it was written about in the New York Times and everything, so a lot of galleries wanted him. And that show traveled to New York. It traveled around the country, and it was shown in New York at the Nobler Gallery, which was the big gallery for ever in New York. Was the top gallery in New York until it finally closed in disgrace. Some of you may have remembered that a few years ago. There was a big art scandal where they were selling knockoff art. That was the end of it. But
Is that painting here?
that painting is not here.
We were trying to locate it.
Yeah,